So I did get a blue screen crash again this week when I tried to create the project, and it seems to be something related to using OneDrive or cloud-based storage. So I'm going to actually go through the creation of the project one more time. The steps are pretty simple, so I'm not doing anything different than what I just recorded. So I apologize if I'm doing it kind of on the quick side here. And hopefully this time I won't blue screen, because if I do, I'll go running for the hills, I think. Got to have a sense of humor about it. Remember, it's not life and death. This is just IT. All right. Well, that seemed to work. Thank goodness. I'm going to go back to where I was in my my PDF document here. All right. So I just completed step 6. No, excuse me, step 5 on page 63, and I'm going to steps number 6 right now. So we created the project. I'm going to go right to the controllers folder, do a right click, and choose add. Hopefully you guys are all with me. We are going to still choose an empty controller at this point. And we're going to create a home controller. And then it will scaffold out and build us our C# file. You can see it zoomed in quite a bit. I'm going to back out just a couple clicks there. All right, so at the top of 64 going on to page 65, they're updating a couple of the action methods here. And the first one that they're going to do is they're going to put a action result, and actually, excuse me, it's just a string called my controller. So it looks like we're going to leave view for index alone, and we're just going to add another method right here. I find it interesting. I'm copying the format that they're using in the book, and I'm noticing that they didn't do a capital C on my controller, so I'm just following it because I know all their examples will be based on it. All right, and even after just that simple little bit of work, they want us to go ahead and run this. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that up. And of course, they're going to want us to control the application through the URL, and they want us to trigger the thing that we just created. Now, we've done this already in class a number of times, so it's kind of this is a repetition thing, just generating a simple view. Now, my application did not launch, believe it or not. This is what I got on my screen. Bingo. I was waiting to see if you guys are catching on. Okay, so the fact that you guys all chimed up, that you realize that I have to add to the URL, shows me that you guys are paying attention, which is a wonderful thing. And really, we need to append that URL. We could set it up so that it automatically goes there, but that's not really the point of this. So if I do this, it should take me to the right spot. Right? I spoke too soon? Yeah, you should be saying, Because why is yours working but not mine? Should we investigate? Yeah, let's do that. Let's go back and look at the code real quick.
Oh, I think spelling error.
Oh, spelling error in my URL?
Yeah, the C needs to be capital. The controller.
Yeah, isn't that interesting though? But did you hear?
Mine's not counted.
Yeah, mine wasn't capitalized in the code though.
Oh,
Yeah. And you notice what it did to my URL, even though I typed it in?
oh,
Isn't that interesting? All right, so I'm not banking on the fact that there's something wrong here. Well, I know why it's not doing anything now. Take a look at my Visual Studio. It's not running.
Oh, the app's
Yeah.
not running.
Yeah, the app's not running, so of course it's not going to work. I know, it's like these silly, goofy things that happen in these. They can drive you a little batty if you're not,
Yeah, the typo.
oh yeah, got to spell things correctly. Boy, I'm batting 1,000 tonight here, aren't I? But hopefully that makes you feel better when you're messing things up, right? That's what I always say. It's like, these kind of things happen. So it is actually working. Thank goodness.
So had you stopped the app running?
I had stopped it thinking that I needed to do a tweak,
Oh, okay.
and then it ended up being just fine. All right, we're going on to step number 10 now, which is bottom of 65, top of 66. And they want us to add another action method. So we're going to go back. Let's stop the application running, and we're going to add another method inside here. This one will be an action result. So we'll do public action result, and I'm not copy pasting it. I'm just going through the laborious process of typing, like it's really that difficult. And then we're just going to return a view, just like so, just like we do for the index. Of course, we have nothing declared yet, right? So when we hit this, we can anticipate that it will be a problem. I kind of don't even need to run it to know that, but the book is asking that we do it, so let's go ahead and do it. Just to prove they're right. Right, but they do want you, this is off of the root, so this is the index method. They want us to make sure that it's for the method that I just created. Do you see what it did to me?
You're messing up,
Oh yeah, absolutely, I totally am. It's called a forward slash, right? Let's prove that it's going to fail. All right, so there it is. And notice what it does. And this is kind of telling of how ASP.NET works. Notice that first line. It says, the view, my view, or its master was not found, or no view engine supports the search locations. So by default, even if I don't tell it expressly where to go, it automatically will start looking through all these files by default to see if it can find what I created. Isn't that interesting? So it kind of gives you a little bit of leverage because it's giving you a piece of information here. And I think that this is really the big takeaway from, when it fails and what it's actually telling you as a result. So, the author says you can see here that we have an error, and this error is actually quite descriptive, which tells us why it can't find it. But for us as coders, what this tells us, back, and we're going to actually add a view, and this is kind of the interesting next takeaway here. Okay, so we've created the method, and here it is on the page, right? And I'm going to just take my cursor and right-click anywhere inside that block of code, and then it wants us to add a view, and notice that's going to be the default action that comes up here. So it recognizes what you're trying to do by virtue of the fact that you called the view method, and then it brings up this new dialog box for you that kind of guides us at this point. All right, so the view name will stay the same because that's what we've called our method. We don't have any templates that we're working off of, and I want you to notice what it says after empty. It says without model. But that gives you the implication here that the next logical step from something like this is you can generate a view that's directly attached to a data model or some sort of data structure. The other thing they want us to uncheck is the layout page thing, because we don't have a layout page. However, if we did, so if we had it a pre-configured layout, so like a certain page scheme that we're using, we can just pull that in automatically as well. And notice that with any of these, there's drop-down boxes. I always say investigate what you're working with, right? So we chose empty without model, but look at all the other possibilities here. We could create, delete, details, edit, empty, and list for the template. And then if we left this layout page checked, then we would actually look for the Razor file that would contain the thing that we're looking for, which, if we had like a really big, robust site that had, certain layout pages that we would want to use in certain scenarios, here's our opportunity to just pull it in and just inject our content directly into it. That's the power in this little interface. All right, so once we have those selections made, go ahead and click Add. Notice what it did for us. It did a scaffolding, right? And now it created what? A MyView CS HTML page. And if you notice where it placed that, notice how the view folder underneath home, because we are in the home controller, now has a view file attached to that home controller. So that's like the default structure it tries to use. At the top we have a Razor directive that says, which layout are we using, and it's set to null because we're not using one. So because of that, you are going to get like the full HTML setup here. So we have a complete HTML document here with the doc type, the head, the body, and the HTML tags all pre-configured for us. All right. Next thing that they'd like us to do, so I'm scrolling down to page 69 now. They want us to put some content in there, and what they're suggesting is right in between the div tags that you add some code and say, "Hi, I am a view." Okay. Now the format that the book is using is like this. Not that it really matters too much. We're just throwing it into an empty div. We're not styling it in any way, attaching style sheets or anything like that. Of course, those would all be options, right? If you have an application that you're building, those would all be options that you could pull into the mix here. Right, now they'd like us to go ahead and run this again. And now we're going to run that same URL we did before. And you notice because I was in the view file when I launched it, do you notice it went right to that view? Did you guys get the same effect? I didn't have to type the URL in this time and mess things up a couple of times to get there. It just took me right there. And because I know what stuff I typed in, there it is. It says, "Hi, I am a view," so we know it worked because it is the right thing. All right. So that was section 11, folks. That was a pretty simple one. This is stuff that we've done before, right? I think that the new piece here that we didn't see yet from the other book was that ability, once you create a method inside of a controller and you put in the view method that you're calling, that you can just right click and it will generate the view automatically for you, name it the right thing, and then have your file just sitting there waiting for you. I think that's the new takeaway here. That's the new piece that we learned. All right.
Question.
Yes.
So, my understanding is right, if you have another page called Pay Bill, you would create a controller for each new page?
Let's say it depends. Okay, so the question was, let's say that you had like a different thing that you're creating. Would you create a controller for each new page? It depends on what you expect the controller to do. So let's think about it like this. If let's say you had like a shopping cart mechanism, maybe that's a good example. And in the shopping cart controller, you would do all the shopping cart actions, right? But if I was on the, let's say, an about page or a home page, the actions that would be related to a home page would be different than the ones related to a shopping cart page. So on a shopping cart page, we might have add item to cart, remove item, check out, calculate shipping, and I'm just like extrapolating, but you kind of get the idea. So that the shopping cart controller would create methods related to that logical construct, and then each one of those methods inside the shopping cart controller would then potentially have a separate view.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
They would be like potentially a one-to-one,
Potentially. Sometimes they might share the same view.
right?
Right.
Depending on the action.
That's right. So really, like if you have like doing a shopping cart controller, you might have one method inside there, just like show me the cart, right? And if you clicked on, let's say, a little link that said remove item from cart, it would go through the programmatic process of removing the item from the cart and then redisplaying the cart. So I wouldn't necessarily have to write a separate show me the cart for each, like if I'm adding or removing an item, it's still showing you the cart. So some can be shared, but some could be generating their own thing.
So with that being said, you wouldn't put show me the cart methods on a home controller. I mean, that to me is illogical.
Yeah, it wouldn't go on a home controller. That would be illogical to me too. Not that you couldn't do it. I think it's considered poor design because you're not really putting the things with like objects, and that would be kind of like, the impetus here, I think, mostly.
Yeah.
All right, we are moving now to section 12, folks, and in section 12, we are going to start working with models. So this is going to be kind of fun. I'm going to go ahead and begin by closing this solution because they do want us to start fresh again. So we're going to go ahead and create a new project. And let me just say a word or two because, I'll address the couple first paragraphs here in section 12. And I'm just going to read the second sentence at the very top of the section. A model stores data that is retrieved according to the commands from the controller and displayed in the view. So the model's job, in essence, is to be our data store for the application. It goes on, it says, a model is a collection of classes wherein you will be working with data and business logic. Hence, basically models are business domain-specific containers. It is used to interact with the database. It can also be used to manipulate the data to implement the business logic. So I want you to really kind of narrow in on a couple things here that are really important in what was said, because it's just a few sentences that really say quite a bit. Models are domain-specific containers. It is used, and it really should say they are used, to interact with a database. The model, this is really important, the model is not the database. It is not where the files are being stored. It is a symbolic abstraction of your data. That's really the key takeaway here. So if you guys, and once in a while I do get students that have been in the program for a while. Has anybody here taken the Ruby on Rails class? No? All right. Well, if you did take that class, we learned real quickly in that class that when you start working with databases and the models, that basically there's an abstraction layer in between you and the data. And that's done on purpose. That keeps you from being a database programmer, basically. Not that you shouldn't understand basic SQL commands, but the problem that happens is often when you get into a professional environment, the person creating and controlling the database is not you. That's the unfortunate reality. If you're building a web application, well, perhaps it might be. But let's say that we were building, like we were just talking about a shopping cart. Let's say we were building a shopping cart. You might be interfacing with the database administrator who already has all the products in the database and is just giving you access to certain aspects of it, mostly to retrieve data from it. And then what you do with it in the application is a completely separate issue. And then ultimately your only write access might be to take whatever order you've placed and pump it back into the database. That might be the only ability you have to write to it. So this is kind of a fascinating technique. All right, so let's actually start building this thing in section 12. So once again, new project, same framework we've been using all along. Go ahead and say next. We're making all the same types of choices here. We're going to do MVC, and this one's going to be called MVC Simple App. This time it maintained my OneDrive folder here in the listing, which I'm happy with. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. Same choices we've been making: empty, MVC folder and core references. I'm unchecking the HTTPS. We're not worried about authentication at this point. So if you have those selections made, go ahead and click Create, and Visual Studio will start scaffolding out your whole structure. That was pretty quick this time, thankfully. All right. Once again, we're going to go right to creating a controller. So let's go right to the controllers folder, do the right click, add controller. This time, hey, we're going to make a different selection this time. Woohoo! Feel like we're learning something new, because we are. So far we've been choosing empty when we put in controllers because we're not really asking it to do anything fancy. But let me put in your head here what we're really doing. We're going to actually select the second option. And as we select it, notice on the right, they give us a little bit of a description. Let's go ahead and read it. So MVC5 controller with read-write actions. By Microsoft, thank you very much. An MVC controller with actions to create, read, update, delete, and list entries. Okay, that sounds pretty cool, right? So let's go ahead, once we've made the selection, and choose Add. We still have to name it. And I'm trying to see, they're having us call it Employee Controller. So there's our Employee Controller. Go ahead and click Add. That completes step number 9 on page 72. Now, before we do anything else, you had a question?
Oh no, I was just, there's a lot more stuff now. I mean,
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. So you're thinking just like me. I mean, you should notice that, hey, my scroll bar's got like more scroll space here. What's really going on? And what we're doing is, okay, we still have the index view that it automatically creates with every thing, but notice that we're getting a view for details. We're getting a view for create. And I want you to notice something else too. Now, they're really good about showing you the HTTP method, action method. So these are gets, so all of them are prefaced and nicely labeled. And then we go to create, and I want you to notice that create's got 2 methods. You guys catching that? So one is relative to a get, that returns a view. The other one is a post, and notice the square bracketed selector filter thing we got there for HTTP post, so it tells us that it's using that particular approach. And keep in mind here, whenever you do a post through an application on HTTP, it is sending data but not visible in the URL, so it's obscuring the data that way. And then obviously it's doing a little bit more work. They got a try catch in there. It ultimately has a view that it returns, but notice it's got this other thing here called a redirect to action, and it's pointing us to something, so we'll figure that out as we go. It also has a get and a post for edit. Keep scrolling. It's got a get and a post for delete. So it covers all those basic operations just by virtue of making that separate selection. We didn't have to code all that. All right, this all happened automatically. It's kind of a beautiful thing. The other thing that you'll notice is, the controller itself and all the little substructures that it formed. So we're seeing that it created the employee controller, but you're also noticing underneath views, it also automatically created a view for us. Now there's nothing inside the view yet. You catching that? So if I click that folder, there's nothing there. But it did create the folder anticipating that if we're going to do all these interactions with data, that we might need some views to display the data in the aftermath. So that's what's happening there. All right, so step number 10 has you basically do what we just did, which is go ahead and look at everything. I'm not seeing that they're changing any of it. They're just listing it out there for us to see. All right. So I'm just scrolling through the PDF right now to confirm that. Now comes our first new thing that we're doing aside from this new scaffolding template. So in step number 11, we're on page number 75 now. We're going to right click on the models folder. So we're going to come over here, right click, choose add, and this time we're going to select a class. Okay. You might think that, well, that means I'll create a connection to a database. Well, sort of. That's kind of what we're doing here, but we're doing a little bit more of like a roundabout method of doing it. And you'll see it in the next step. So choose class, and that will create help us create a class file. It brings up this dialog. Make sure that class is selected and that Visual C# is your option. And then down at the bottom where it asks you to name it, they want you to name it employee.cs. Once you make that entry there, go ahead and click add. And then it will build out a simple C# file. I want you to notice where it placed it. It put it under the models folder. And then what we're doing here is this class file, this is really a great way to think of it. This is really similar to what we've done in other object-oriented languages where we create a class file of our own and then instantiate it in our programs. So this kind of thing you should have learned in your Java classes, right? So I think back to the Java class, and I would always assign, for example, a couple of assignments, and one of them was like a sandwich class, and the other one was like a create your own like video game character class, right? And then they have certain properties or attributes that belong to that thing, and then you instantiate it, and then when you instantiate it, all those properties follow, right? And you run constructor functions to apply capabilities to that individual class to make it unique. And that's basically what we're doing here is we're going to throw in a few different things. And I am just copy pasting from the PDF, folks, and hopefully it's clean. Yeah, that came in real nicely. And so that's what we're creating. We have an ID for employee, which is an int. We have their name, which is a string. So we're assuming first and last name. We have a date time, which is their joining date, and then another int, which is their age. All right? And notice in C#, the beautifully simple get and set, I don't have to write a bunch of separate methods for them to make it all happen. And that's one thing I do like about this language is that little feature right there is nice and simple. All right. So that's really pretty simplistic, and I kind of like it in so many different ways. But we are also going to do another thing, which is we are going to kind of, I guess I would call this hot wiring it in a sense, because we're going to add to it some pre-built data. So right here we're defining the data structure. But now we're going to add some data to the application so that it already has this inside of it. Now, we're not going to add it here. So this sets up the model for the data. And I want you to also put this in your mind as we go forward. I'm saving it. So we have a structure for how our data is. And one way I like to think about these is this is almost kind of like defining the columns of a table in a database. You guys see the correlation? right? Because these are the same kind of things you would think about as you're building a database. But now we want to have some actual data to put in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the employee controller CS file, and inside that file they want us to add one more additional method that is basically going to give us all that data. So what we want to do is scroll way to the bottom, and I'm also trying to find the right set of curly brackets. So it's not the outermost set. We want to be inside the second closing curly brace when we throw this in. So because we still want to be inside the namespace. So we want to be inside here. So I'm going to add some lines and then throw in our code. Now, this is, I'm on page 77 in the tutorial document, and they have a complete listing there. And what I'm going to try to do, I'm making the attempt to just kind of copy it all in one fell swoop, because it just so happens to all be on one page, thankfully. And then I'm going to come right inside here and I'm pasting. Yeah, I didn't paste all too beautifully, did it? All right, so I'm going to be going through the process of cleaning it up to look like what's on page number 77. So I'm just going to take my time with it and make sure that it all looks pretty. And remember, you know, Visual Studio really kind of doesn't care. And I'm trying to ignore all the little red flags right now. And I'm trying to see what it's, oh yeah, it's not recognizing employee yet. Okay. Well, one step at a time application. And as I start to break this code apart to match what's in our book, what you're going to see is a collection of key value pairs, as I like to call them, that identify each individual employee that we're creating. So really, in essence, what we're doing is we're taking that class that we pre-created and we're instantiating 4 new employees. So I'm trying to follow the book format, and I don't know if you guys are catching my formatting technique here. Yeah, don't freak out to the fact that employee is underlined right now, because that will be fixed. It's great when you make the same mistake twice here. There's a reason for that. Does anybody want to take a guess as to what the reason is?
We haven't defined it somewhere else. Or
Yeah, well, we haven't imported it, or we haven't declared a using statement that pulls it in, did we? All right, and you know, interestingly, the book hasn't asked us to do that yet, and it's like one of those like weird things that, you know, you don't always catch on to. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to scroll down to that section, and I'm just going to hover over this, and it says the type or namespace employee could not be found. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? Show potential fixes. All right, so the one potential fix is, it says MVC simple app model, so it pulls in all the models. It is telling us, well, you need to do this, or you need to do that, right? So notice how one thing that you can do, and this is fascinating, look at this solution that they have here. The type or namespace employee could not be found, or you missing a directory, blah, 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 and then it would actually generate the class employee for us. Now, we already created it, right? So we just really have to attach to it is kind of the whole thing. But this is also telling you that if you type this code first, it could automatically generate the other piece for you. So the actual fix in this case is going to be this using statement right here. And then you'll see that it adds the using statement at the top, So it points back to our own application and to the models folder, so that it finds employee and it does become valid. Now, one thing that I think is a little bit interesting in how the application is working here is they're not asking us to do it that way. So guess what I'm just about to do? Control Z. So I'm removing that reference and letting it highlight red again, right? Because they're going to use a different technique for fixing it. Okay? You guys with me? There's a reason they didn't tell us to do this yet. Go ahead and save all your files anyhow so far, even if they're chock full of mistakes. Don't freak out. Now we're going to go to the index method inside the employee controller, and we're going to adjust it a little bit. So we have to get some different code in there. So we're going to still return the view, but here's one of the catches. We're going to return a view called employees. That's going to underline red too. Remember, we don't have the connection yet. Right up above it, we're going to type in some code. I'm copying this from the top of page 78. So it's basically going to set up a variable for us that defines employees, which was not defined. And then we're going to use this special syntax here that's available inside Visual Studio called LINQ. It's L-I-N-Q. If you're curious, they don't really talk about it yet here in the chapter. But those of you that maybe had the Intro to Programming and Database class here, where they learned a little bit of basic database stuff in building applications with Visual Studio, you may have encountered this before. But I want you to notice that the syntax of this is not really SQL. You guys catching that? It's kind of SQL-like. And I'm not here right now to talk about the format of the syntax. We're just copying the code in. But it is indicating to you that we are pulling in certain aspects, and we're ordering by ID, and then we're going to select something, So what is E in get employee list? Well, where's get employee list? Isn't that the thing that we just created at the bottom? Right here. So that's basically reading in the data set that we have. It's ordering it by ID and putting it on the screen. That's in essence what we're doing in this method. So in the index method, we're triggering that method, which populates the data. We're reading it in, sorting it by ID, and putting it on the screen, and selecting the list so that we can do stuff with it. All right. The next step is to run it and see that it fails. We know it's going to fail because, there's all these red marks here on the side, right? So let's, like I said, don't freak out to that. Just go with it. And it says there were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? I'm going to say no. Now, the other thing that's going to happen here is I find, that how do they expect us to actually run and build this with the error in place? They didn't tell us to go ahead and fix it, correct?
Is your employee still underlined in red?
Yes, it is. It is still underlined in red. All right, now at this point, since we really know what that fix is, let's go ahead and scroll back down and hover over any one of these, and let's just bring in that using statement because we know that's the fix, okay? Save your work. Now try running it. So we're still repeating step number 15 here. And after we run this, they want us to append employee to the URL. So let's let it load up. Let's type in employee. I'm noticing that they're typing it in all lowercase, but they are spelling it correctly, which I almost didn't. All right, and try to run that. You are still getting an error message, right? Okay, totally expected. That's what they told us to do, right? Go ahead and close this window, and let's move on to step number 16. So we're at the bottom of 78, going on to page 79 at this point. All right, now what they're trying to show us here is, once again, that we did all this, and we're asking it to return a view which doesn't exist, okay? So what we have to do is create that view, and so we're going to, once again, somewhere inside this block of code, anywhere inside that block of code, do a right click and choose Add View. All right, you're going to get this secondary dialog that comes up, and here's where we start to, once again, start to make some different selections. We are going to leave it as an index view. Okay, that's going to stay the same. The template that we're going to choose is a list, meaning that we're going to list out the data that we have in our data structure. Okay, but then we get to choose a model class right here. Now notice that this selection, if I would have known to have done this before, notice what it does. It says employee MVC simple app dot models. Doesn't that sound like the using statement we just dropped in?
Yes.
Right, it is. And you know, guess what that does when I make that selection? It does exactly that. Okay, so here's one instruction set in here that's kind of a little backwards, so I'm just kind of like pointing that out to you guys. The other thing that we're going to uncheck here is we're not going to use a layout page. We don't have one created yet, but if we did, we might. And we're leaving the reference script libraries alone because we are going to choose that. All right, go ahead and choose Add. Notice the scaffolding. Notice that it's also adding jQuery to our project. So that automatically goes out there and says, well, if we're using this tool, we're using jQuery to do it. So if we're using jQuery to do it, guess what it's doing? It's pulling in all those libraries into the script folder. So if I go to my script folder now, it's like everything jQuery is in there. Boom. I don't have to go to NuGet and do it manually. I don't have to go to the jQuery website and download it. None of that stuff. It just happens. Beautiful. All right. Now, what it's doing next is it is creating this index view for the employee controller. So you see, like, kind of like the layers here. So when we have an employee controller and we generate a view, it puts it under the views folder, under an employee folder, and because it's the index view for employee, this will be the default thing that gets called up when we append employee to our URL. I do think that you should kind of look at this file a little bit and get familiar with the kind of stuff it does automatically. So up at the top, once again, we have a couple of Razor directives. We have one thing at the top that says IEnumerable, and notice what it calls. It calls MVC Simple App, that's our app, models, that's the models folder, and it goes to the employee model that exists inside the model folder. And what that means is IEnumerable is it's reading that in, whenever you see those little brackets in there, that indicates an array list, right? So it's reading in all that stuff and enumerating it into some sort of a data structure that therefore we can pull into the application. There is no layout again. And then we have a standard HTML document type here, and then it's got a whole bunch of Razor directives listed. So notice, first of all, inside of a paragraph here, it's got an HTML action link. I wonder what this one does, create new. Yes, it's going to give us the ability to create a new entry for our data structure. Scrolling down, put it in a table. That might not be what you choose, as your best output. And yes, you can tweak this HTML, folks. So if you don't want to put it in a table, you can totally change it.
You change it to unordered list.
Unordered list, divs, paragraphs, whatever you want. Okay, so the sky's the limit. It just does this by default because tables work well with database content, and you know what? That's what tables were originally designed for anyways, was to deliver tabular data, which is stuff from a table. So these are, of course, the table headers. So what it's going to pull up is the display name for whatever model we're pulling in. And notice how it pulled in name, joining date, and age. It didn't pull in one of them, though, which I think is kind of interesting. It did not pull in the ID. All right. And then it sets up a loop, and we learned about this, how the loops operate. So this is a for each. I'm trying to get these little extra windows out of the way here. And so in the first row that it's going to generate, it's going to actually display the actual item that is in the table. Then it's also going to display the joining date and the age of whatever the entry is. And then in the last cell in the table, it's going to give us links. So notice how these are all action links. So it's pre-creating links that allow us to edit, look at the details of, or delete the entry in that same table row. Isn't that cool? I think it's cool. Because I don't have to code it. And I don't have to worry about it being wrong in the process of me coding it. It just creates it. Because it's a for each loop, it's just going to cycle through my data. So for every entry that I created, it's going to put the stuff up on the screen and then also give me the ability to adjust it at the same time. All right, I think that's pretty darn cool. We don't have to alter it in any way. So go ahead and maybe do a save all if it's not already saved. And let's run this thing and see what happens. Now, we will still need to navigate to the URL. So if you get an error like this, you didn't do anything wrong, we're going to actually go ahead and type in employee. That will trigger the index method, and notice what it did. It read the information that we populated into the employee controller file, put it up on the screen. So it gave us the name, the joining date and time, their age. We're not seeing their IDs, okay? And if you actually go back to Visual Studio, you want to see those IDs, that would be at the bottom of the employee controller, and they're just sequentially numbered. Okay, that's probably not a realistic example of an employee ID, but I guess if you're the first employee, you might be 001 or something like that. So
could you edit
Nope,
that?
I just tried it.
Add it?
yeah, so Brenda's thinking, like I think, could we add
Oh,
that to the structure?
Yeah.
Absolutely, why not? You could go into that, the view file, add a table data cell, follow the naming format here, pull in the ID, and show it. Just remember that you're working with a table, so if you're adding a table data cell to one row, you better add it to the other row too, so that it's consistent. So that's absolutely possible.
Why by default does it not pick up all the fields that were originally there?
That's a really good question.
I find that to be odd.
I think it's a little odd too. Yeah, so what Brenda was asking is why doesn't it automatically put it in there? It's a great question. I'm not really sure I can answer it, honestly, off the top of my head, that there's like a reason for it. Could it be the way that we typed it in? I don't think so. It just made an assumption that I think that the ID field, this is my educated guess, that the ID field, so think of like when you do database design, it's always a good idea to have an ID field even if you don't use it for anything, because it gives you a sorting tool or a way to index everything. So I think the assumption here is that because we used ID as a value, that it's that kind of a column. So let's say if we actually wanted to have an employee ID, that might be one that it would pick up and display. And if I was really doing database work, that would be the smart play, because the one ID would be for database usage and the other one would be the actual ID.
I follow you there. That makes sense.
Right?
I was assuming their ID was their employee ID, but it's probably more of a reference.
Yeah, it's more of a reference tool. And so, I mean, and this isn't the database class that teach that concept, but hopefully you guys kind of get that. But I think that's really pretty darn fun. And basically, if you got that to work, folks, guess what? Yay, you completed section 12. and completed another assignment. So do your screenshots. Probably want to screenshot this. And I know that you guys are probably tempted to go ahead and start clicking the edit and the
Yeah.
details and the delete. You know what? And you can. It's not really a big deal. Won't harm anything. But that's not the point of this chapter. They pretty much want us to stop at this point. So let's call this a success. And this video will end here. We're going to take a break in class. And actually that's not true. The video will not end here. I still want to talk about chapter 4. We're still taking a break in class before we do. I'm going to add a little bit of content from our other book into the mix here. So we're back from break now, and of course, my students, of course, did try these links. I encouraged them, they could go ahead and actually do this, right? But then I think they had a little bit of an aha, for example, because if you click on these, you're going to see that, wait, this isn't working for the same reason some of the other stuff wasn't working. We haven't created a view for it, and we haven't created the methods to actually handle the interaction. Right, so of course you're not going to get much, but I know people will go ahead and click on them. In fact, you can try all of them, and all of them will basically do the same thing. However, it did pre-create the link to it, right? And so all we have to do is tie in some code. So none of them actually have any actions behind them yet. The question that you should ask next is, can those be automatically created too? That's what your brain should be thinking. And you know what? There are ways to make that happen. One step at a time though, folks. This is a big step forward really because we're seeing kind of like the procedure of it all. All right, let's jump over to chapter 4 in our main textbook and look at some important concepts here. So this is going to kind of be, let's call it a speed lecture on models in the aftermath of actually doing some of the work. And they talk about a whole bunch of different stuff in here, but I want to really hit on highlights. So one of the big takeaways, and I think I mentioned this already, is that with models we are really building kind of an abstraction layer between our application and the actual data that we're working with. In some cases, the data that we're working with is something that we'll build right into the application like we just did. In fact, often what people will do is they'll create the class file to structure the data like we did, kind of like a table definition, and then they'll actually build a separate class file which will just simply feed the data back in. They don't have to be bundled into the controller like we did. It might just be a separate file. So I think that's pretty important. They're going back to the music store example here, and they go actually through the process of doing some builds and playing with this stuff. And I'm not a huge fan of where they were taking this in the book, which is why I decided not to follow their example. If you were interested in doing this, I think you guys will notice that I offered this as an extra credit assignment. So if you want to pick up some points after seeing how we just did it in class, you can go in here and play with this a little bit. And I did highlight what are actually the steps for completing it. And what they do here is they do actually build a model for an album. So you have a music store and you're buying a record album, right? We just did an employee example, but if you were thinking about a record album, notice what they're doing here in terms of structuring this particular class. So they're actually building a class called album, all with a bunch of gets and sets and all the different fields that would correlate to like a database or a table structure for the data. And so they're putting in album ID, genre ID, artist ID, title, price, album art URL, genre, and artist. And some of these things are text, some of them are strings, some of them are numbers. So it's not something that actually runs any code. But what they're identifying here really is really kind of a database structure. So they're building another class that's just the artist model, and that's just going to be the artist ID and the name. And then they start talking about things like foreign keys and how we're going to start linking the tables together. And then they're also building a table for the genre of music. So that's got an ID, a name, a description, and then a list that lists all the albums that might fall into that category. And then the next thing they do is they get to the point where they do their scaffolding. So here's where it gets a little more interesting. So in their example, they're starting with 3 tables. Not 1 table, 3 tables. Okay? And then the other thing that's really fascinating about this technology is I don't have to sit there and declare the relationships between tables. Catch this, this is a big one. Because of the way I named them, it's going to recognize that in this thing I have a genre ID, an artist ID, and an album ID. And then when I put it in another table and I say artist ID, the Visual Studio Engine, the MVC scaffolding engine actually, is intelligent enough to go, well, this table's got an artist ID, and so does this one. Guess what? Why don't we link them together?
Also, it kind of skips all the primary key, foreign key.
Yeah, it makes some assumptions,
All right.
and it operates on that. Now, the assumptions can sometimes not operate correctly. I will throw that in there too. But if you do really like a basic logical design, it will pick up those things automatically and put them all together for you. So the scaffolding engine, once you start to choose, these different options, will start to build various levels with this. So now as you read these options, we were always doing empty to start with, right? And then we put in read-write actions. But we saw that you still have to build stuff to go with it. Next one, controller scaffolders. So they would actually build in certain tools. Look at the bottom trace here, MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. And ultimately that's where we're building towards, because Entity Framework is that database tool that allows our applications to talk to actual databases. Now, the fascinating thing is this. When we start using an Entity Framework, notice that in that listing there, they actually start talking about interacting with the database. So it's possible that you write your code first, and think of that phrase, code first, to declare the structure of a table. And then when you scaffold it, you press the button and it scaffolds. It not only builds all the stuff that we just saw, but it also builds the database. That's really powerful, folks. So that's called code first database building, and that's a big part of NVC as well. So we're not actually going in to like SQL Server or whatever and like writing all these SQL statements and making our tables and doing the joins and foreign keys and all that stuff, which is kind of happening automatically. To me, that's like a game changer, right? And remember, this technology is not new, but for you guys it's new. And just a conception of what's happening here alone is important. So why this is important is so much work in .NET, when you guys go out into the professional work world, is done in this format. Entity Framework usually is the big tool that we're using. It's usually tying into SQL Server or an internal database. So there's a couple little qualifiers there. When you are working with these options, when you're just using Visual Studio on its own, Visual Studio has an internal web server, which we've been working with all along. It also has an internal database tool called SQL Server Express. It's a lightweight version of SQL Server. If you do not have SQL Server running on your machine, Visual Studio's SQL Server Express will kick in and do the database work automatically. However, if you do have SQL Server already installed and running on your laptop or desktop or whatever, all your database stuff will be built inside a SQL Server. So one of the big questions I get, as soon as we start doing this stuff, is like, well, I can't find it. It's not there. It's not attaching correctly or something like that. And what's happening is if you have SQL Server running in the background already, Visual Studio says, oh, you already have this. All right, well, let's just attach to that. Why run the mini version of it when you have the full-blown version already running? That's the logic. So if you do have SQL Server running on your equipment, which is highly possible if you took our database class, that's where your databases will end up. You guys catching that? Okay, that's an important detail. All right, so they start to talk a little bit more about the entity framework and how it operates. And I'm not going to spend too much more time on this because I do want to get to the next section. But it does use a couple of these really important tools. And anybody that's worked with databases and to any, like, you know, even moderate professional level will recognize a lot of this terminology. So one of the things you'll see is this ORM, the object relational mapping. And what that means is the entity framework acts as our abstraction layer where it converts database content into objects inside of our application that we can then manipulate. It does so automatically. That's why we use it as a tool. So if something's inside of a database, inside of a table, inside of a field, we use some simple syntax that looks like basically object syntax, you know, where you might have, you know, the database name, dot the table, dot the field, dot the data. And it builds it out as an object. The other thing that it brings into the mix is this whole link query thing, which is kind of like a poor man's SQL, so to speak, but it is what the tools use inside the entity framework to do that communication. So you're not writing SQL statements, you're writing link statements that then do get converted to SQL, by the way, in order to query the database. And yes, there's a whole syntax that goes with it, and you know, frankly, it's a whole field of study. But one thing goes first. All right, so they have this interesting little box here, and this is where I'm going to actually end the talk about this for now. All right, and it says, which comes first, the code or the database? Now, I just told you that the approach that they were showing in the book here in this chapter was they're building the code first, and that's like a whole technique, code first. And here they're also calling it model first or database first, which is not the same thing. So there's two implications here. One is if you don't have a pre-existing database and you're building an application, you can build it with your code, and running the code, it'll make all the connections, whatever, and build you a database. Boom. Right inside a SQL Server for you. However, a lot of that application building really is done the other way around, right? Where there is pre-existing data and then you just are connecting to it, and that involves a different approach. The predominant focus in the tutorials that we're doing is a code-first approach. Later on, when we actually start making database interactions, you'll see the differences between the two approaches. Sometimes, you know, what will happen is we're doing a code-first approach, and you run the application once, it builds the data, and then you run it again, it's not going to rebuild it. It'll recognize that it already exists and just attach to it. So there is a little bit of both going on. I think it's probably more common for some, you know, application builders that usually they're handed a database or given access to a database, and they just have to figure out how to manipulate it professionally. So that's my end of talk for Chapter 4. So I'm going to go ahead and end this video here, and we'll create a new one and get rolling on the next section.